The summer of 1879 had been unkind to the wagon trains crossing the Montana Territory, and Eva Shelton had learned that lesson the hard way when her guide abandoned her a full day's ride from the nearest settlement. She stood now among a sea of wildflowers that stretched toward mountains capped in ice even in the heat of July, her traveling dress torn at the hem, her small leather case of perfume vials clutched against her chest like it was the only solid thing left in a world that had gone entirely to pieces. The case had cost her nearly everything she owned. Inside it were the glass bottles she had carried from New Orleans, essences distilled from roses and jasmine and rare orchids, the tools of a trade that had brought her all this way west in search of new flowers, new scents, new fortune. She had not expected to find herself lost. The guide, a weathered man named Hollis who had promised safe passage to Bozeman, had ridden off before dawn that morning with her horse and half her supplies, muttering something about a debt he owed that could not wait. Eva had woken to find herself alone beside a dying campfire, the vast Montana wilderness pressing in from every direction, and no earthly idea which way led to civilization. She had walked since sunrise. The wildflowers, she noted even in her panic, were extraordinary. Lupin in shades of violet she had never seen bottled. Indian paintbrush burning orange against the green. Something like a wild bergamot that released its scent when crushed beneath her boots, sharp and citrus-sweet. Under different circumstances, she might have knelt to gather samples, to press petals between the pages of her notebook. Instead, she stumbled forward with blistered feet, her throat raw from calling out for help that never came. By midday the sun had climbed high and merciless, and Eva's water skin had run dry an hour before. She sank down onto a fallen log at the edge of the flower field, her chest heaving, and allowed herself, for the first time since Hollis's betrayal, to cry. It was in that moment, with her face buried in her hands and her shoulders shaking, that she heard the sound of hooves. She looked up sharply, hope and fear warring in equal measure. A rider had emerged from the tree line at the far edge of the meadow, sitting tall atop a broad-chested bay horse. Even at a distance, she could see he was a big man, broad through the shoulders in a way that filled out his buckskin coat, with dark hair that fell past his collar and a rifle slung easily across his back. He rode with the unhurried confidence of a man who belonged entirely to this wilderness, who had never once been lost in his life. Eva's first instinct was fear. A woman alone in the territory had every reason to fear a strange man riding out of nowhere. But her second instinct, stronger than the first, was desperate relief, because whatever this man was, he was the only living soul she had seen in 6 hours, and if she did not find help soon, she was not certain she would survive the night. She rose unsteadily to her feet and lifted her hand. "Please," she called, her voice cracking. "Please, sir, I need help." The rider reined in his horse at the edge of the flowers, and for a moment he simply looked at her, as if trying to understand what a woman in a torn traveling dress was doing standing alone in the middle of a wildflower field 40 miles from the nearest town. Then he swung down from his saddle in one smooth motion and started toward her, and Eva saw that he was even larger than she had first thought, easily filling the space around him, his forearms thick with the kind of muscle that came from years of hard living rather than any gymnasium. His face was tanned deep brown from sun and wind, lined at the eyes from squinting into distant horizons, and though his jaw was rough with several days' growth of beard, his eyes, when they met hers, were a startling clear gray, gentle in a way that did not match the rest of his imposing frame. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and steady, "you are a long way from anywhere out here." "I know that better than anyone," Eva said, and to her horror, a sob escaped her before she could stop it. The man's expression shifted immediately from caution to concern. He closed the remaining distance between them in a few long strides and reached out, not quite touching her, as though unsure whether she would welcome it. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "Is there anyone with you?" "No," she managed. "My guide left me this morning. He took my horse, most of my supplies. I have been walking for hours and I do not know which direction leads anywhere at all." The man's jaw tightened, and something dark passed behind his gray eyes, an anger on her behalf that she had not expected from a stranger. "Man left a woman alone out here," he said, more to himself than to her. "That is about as low as a man can go." "Please," Eva said again, hating how small her voice sounded. "I do not mean to be a burden. I only need to know the way to Bozeman or any town at all. I have money, I can pay for provisions. You are not paying me for anything," the man said, cutting her off gently but firmly. "First thing is water. You look about to fall over." He turned back to his horse and unhooked a canteen from the saddle, pressing it into her hands. Eva drank greedily, the water cool and metallic and better than anything she had tasted in her life. When she finally lowered the canteen, she found the man watching her with an expression she could not quite read, something between concern and curiosity. "My name is Daniel Garrison," he said. "I have got a cabin about 6 miles from here, up along the creek. It is closer than any town, and you are in no condition to be walking further today. Tomorrow, if you are willing, I can guide you into Bozeman myself." Eva hesitated. Every lesson her mother had ever taught her about propriety screamed against the idea of traveling alone to a strange man's cabin. But she looked around at the endless field of flowers, at the mountains that offered no path forward, at the sun already beginning its slow descent toward evening, and she understood that propriety was a luxury she could not currently afford. "I would be very grateful, Mr. Garrison," she said. "Daniel," he corrected, and something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Not much for formality out here, ma'am." "Then you must call me Eva," she said. "Eva Shelton." "Eva Shelton," he repeated, as though testing the shape of it. "Well, Miss Shelton, let us get you off your feet before you fall down in front of me." He helped her onto his horse with a gentleness that surprised her, his large hands closing around her waist to lift her into the saddle, as though she weighed nothing at all despite her size. Then he swung up behind her, and Eva felt a flush rise to her cheeks at the closeness of him, the solid warmth of his chest against her back, the way his arm came around her to hold the reins. "Hold on to the pommel," he said. "The trail gets rough further up." Eva did as she was told, gripping the leather pommel with both hands as Daniel nudged the horse into a walk. For a long while neither of them spoke. The flowers swayed around them in a breeze that carried their mingled scent, and Eva found herself, despite her exhaustion and fear, cataloging it instinctively. Lupin and paintbrush and something floral she could not name, something entirely new. "You keep looking at the flowers like they mean something to you," Daniel said after a while, his voice rumbling pleasantly close to her ear. "They do," Eva said. "I am a perfumer, Mr. Garrison, Daniel. I came west to find new scents, flowers that have not yet been captured in glass. This meadow alone has 3 or 4 varieties I have never encountered before." "A perfumer," Daniel said, and there was no mockery in his voice, only genuine interest. "Never met one of those before." "Did not know that was a trade a person could have." "It is uncommon," Eva admitted. "Most perfumers in this country are men, trained in France or brought over from there. I learned from my father, who had a shop in New Orleans. When he passed, I decided I wanted to make something of my own, something that smelled like the places I had actually been, rather than flowers grown in some hothouse in Europe. And that brought you all the way out here." "That brought me all the way out here," Eva agreed, and then laughed, a small, exhausted sound. "Though I admit this was not quite the adventure I imagined." "Most adventures rarely are," Daniel said, and Eva thought she heard something knowing in his tone, something that suggested he had learned that lesson himself, once, in some way she did not yet understand. They rode in silence after that, the horse picking its way along a trail that wound gradually upward, away from the wildflower meadow and into thicker stands of pine. Eva watched the landscape change around her, the air growing cooler and sharper with the scent of resin and damp earth, and despite everything, despite the terror of the morning and the humiliation of being abandoned, She felt something in her chest begin to loosen. She was not alone anymore. Whatever else was true, she was not alone. Daniel Garrison's cabin sat in a small clearing beside a creek that ran clear and fast over smooth stones, the water catching the late afternoon light like scattered silver. The cabin itself was modest but sturdy, built of hewn logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch where dried herbs hung in bundles from the eaves. A garden plot showed neat rows of vegetables, and a linta beside the cabin sheltered firewood stacked with meticulous care. It was, Eva thought, the home of a man who lived alone but did not live carelessly. Daniel helped her down from the horse, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary at her waist before he stepped back and busied himself with the saddle. "It is not much," he said, nodding toward the cabin, "but it is warm and it is dry, and you will be safe here tonight." "It is more than I could have hoped for 2 hours ago," Eva said honestly. Inside, the cabin was simply furnished but clean, a single room with a stone fireplace, a table and 2 chairs, a narrow bed against the far wall, and shelves lined with books that surprised Eva more than anything else she had seen so far. She ran her eyes over the spines while Daniel built up the fire, noting titles on botany, on medicine, on the history of the Western Territories, even a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets that looked as though it had been read many times over. "You are surprised," Daniel said, catching her look without turning from the fire. "I did not expect a mountain man to keep a library," Eva admitted. "A man can be more than one thing," Daniel said, and there was a faint edge to his voice, though not unkind. "I was not always up here alone in these mountains. I had some schooling once. Life just took me a different direction than I planned." Eva wanted to ask what direction that had been, what had brought a clearly educated man to live in solitary isolation in the Montana wilderness. But something in the set of his shoulders told her the subject was not one he offered easily, and she did not wish to pry on the very first evening of their acquaintance. "I have some dried venison and beans," Daniel said instead, moving to the small kitchen area. "Not much of a feast, but it will fill you up, and I expect you will want to wash up first. There is a basin and clean water just outside, and I can offer you a shirt to sleep in if your dress needs mending." Eva looked down at her torn and dirt-streaked dress and felt a fresh wave of exhaustion. "That would be very kind, thank you." He gave her privacy to wash outside, standing watch a respectful distance away with his back turned, and when she returned wearing one of his flannel shirts over her underclothes, the sleeves rolled up several times to fit her smaller frame, she found him already at the table, setting out 2 plates of food with the careful attention of a man unused to having company but determined to do right by it. They ate in the glow of the fire and a single oil lamp, and slowly, over the course of the meal, Eva found herself talking more than she had intended. She told him about her father's shop in New Orleans, about the years she had spent learning to distinguish 100 different florals by scent alone, about her mother who had died when Eva was young and left her father to raise her among bottles of tuberose and bergamot. She told him about the journey west, about her hopes of establishing her own perfumery, perhaps in San Francisco, using scents no other perfumer in the country possessed. Daniel listened with an attentiveness that made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, truly heard. When she finally paused, embarrassed at how much she had shared, he offered pieces of his own story in return, though more sparingly. "I came out here 9 years ago," he said. "After the war, I fought for the Union, saw things in Georgia and the Carolinas that I still cannot make peace with even now. When it was over, I could not settle back into the life I had before. My family had a farm in Ohio, expected me to come home and take it over, marry the girl I had promised myself to before I left. But I was not the same man who left for that war, and staying there felt like trying to fit into skin that no longer belonged to me." "So you came west," Eva said softly. "So I came west," Daniel agreed. "Been up in these mountains most of 9 years now, Trap in the winter, trade furs in Bozeman a few times a year, grow what I can in that garden out there. It is a quiet life, suits me better than anything did before. Do you not get lonely? Eva asked and immediately regretted the bluntness of the question, though Daniel did not seem offended by it. I did for a long while, he admitted. Less so now. A man gets used to his own company, learns to find peace in it. But I will not pretend there are not nights the quiet gets to be too much. Something in the way he said it, honest and unguarded, made Eva's chest ache in a way she did not fully understand. She thought of her own solitude these past years, the shop she had run alone after her father's death, the suitors she had turned away because none of them had ever looked at her the way she wanted to be looked at, as though she were something more than a woman who could keep a tidy house and bear children. I understand that better than you might think, she said quietly. Daniel's gray eyes met hers across the small table, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the fire crackling between them, the sound of the creek outside a steady, peaceful murmur. Then Daniel cleared his throat and looked away, as though suddenly aware of how close the moment had drawn them. You should sleep, he said. It has been a hard day and tomorrow will be a long ride into town. You can have the bed, I will take the floor by the fire. I could not possibly ask you to give up your own bed, Eva protested. You are not asking, Daniel said. I am offering, and I would not sleep easy knowing a lady was on my floor while I took the bed. That is not how I was raised. Eva relented, too exhausted to argue further, and allowed Daniel to arrange blankets for himself on the floor while she settled into the narrow bed, the flannel shirt she wore still carrying the faint scent of him, wood smoke and pine, and something warmer underneath that she could not quite name, but found herself drawn to nonetheless. She fell asleep faster than she expected, lulled by the crackling fire and the steady sound of Daniel's breathing across the room, and for the first time since Holly's had abandoned her, she did not dream of being lost. Eva woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon, sunlight streaming through the cabin's single window in a way that painted everything gold. For a moment she simply lay still, disoriented, before the events of the previous day came rushing back. She sat up quickly, running a hand through her tangled hair, and found Daniel already awake and dressed, tending to a skillet over the fire. Morning, he said, glancing over his shoulder at her. Slept well. Better than I expected to, given the circumstances, Eva admitted. Good. You will need your strength. It is a fair ride into Bozeman, and I want to get you there before dark. Eva dressed quickly behind a curtain Daniel had rigged for privacy, mending what she could of her torn hem with a needle and thread he offered from a small sewing kit that seemed oddly domestic for a man who lived alone in the wilderness. When she emerged, he had already saddled his horse and packed provisions for the journey, and he looked her over with an assessing eye that made her feel, not uncomfortable but strangely cared for. There is a spare hat in my saddlebag, he said. Sun gets fierce out on the open trail, would not want you burned. The thoughtfulness of it, the small consideration for her comfort that he offered so easily and without expectation of thanks, struck Eva more deeply than she wanted to admit. She had known men who considered themselves gentlemen, suitors back in New Orleans who wore fine coats and spoke pretty words, but none of them had ever thought to protect her from something as simple as the sun. They set out shortly after, Daniel walking alongside the horse for the first stretch to spare the animal the weight of two riders on the steep trail down from the cabin. Eva watched him move, the easy strength in his stride, the way he seemed to read the land around them without conscious effort, noting a broken branch here, a set of tracks there, the distant call of a hawk that he identified without looking up. You know this land like the back of your hand, Eva observed. 9 years will do that to a man, Daniel said. This land is not always kind, but it is honest. You learn to respect it. It does not often turn on you without warning. Unlike people, Eva said, thinking of Holly's. Daniel glanced at her, something sympathetic in his expression. Unlike people, yes. Though I would not judge all people by the actions of one coward who left a woman stranded to save his own hide. You did not seem surprised when I told you, Eva said. About Holly's leaving me. I was surprised, Daniel said, and angry if I am honest, but I have seen enough of men's worst natures out here to know it happens. Desperation makes cowards of folks who might otherwise have some decency in them. Does not excuse it, just explains it. They stopped at midday beside a stream to rest the horse and eat a simple meal of bread and dried meat that Daniel had packed. Eva found herself wandering a few steps away toward a cluster of flowers growing along the water's edge and could not help herself, kneeling to examine them despite the dirt that would surely stain her mended dress. "You cannot help yourself, can you?" Daniel said, amusement warm in his voice as he watched her. "It is an occupational hazard," Eva said without looking up, crushing a small purple bloom between her fingers and lifting it to her nose. "This one. I do not recognize it at all. Something almost like violet but sharper, with an undertone of something almost spiced." "Wild geranium," Daniel said, "grows all along these creek bottoms this time of year." Eva looked up at him, surprised. "You know it by name." "I told you I had some schooling," Daniel said, a note of pride entering his voice despite his earlier reticence on the subject. "Botany was one of my interests before the war took me away from that kind of study. I know most every flower and tree in these mountains, and plenty of the medicinal uses for them besides." "Daniel Garrison, you are a man of many surprises," Eva said, and found herself smiling, a genuine smile that felt strange after the fear and exhaustion of the previous day. "I could say the same of you, Miss Shelton," Daniel said. "Never met a woman who could name a scent I could not place myself, and I thought I knew most everything that grows out here." They lingered a while longer beside the stream, Daniel naming flowers for her as she found them, Eva committing each one to memory with the careful attention of a scholar, until the sun's position reminded them both that the day was passing and Bozeman still lay some hours ahead. As they continued on, Eva found herself watching Daniel more than she probably should have, noting the way the sunlight caught in his dark hair, the corded strength of his forearms as he led the horse over uneven ground, the quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from him despite his evident solitude. She had never met a man quite like him, someone who could speak of Shakespeare and wildflowers and the horrors of war in the same easy manner, someone whose strength seemed matched entirely by a gentleness she had not expected from a man who lived so far from the comforts of civilization. They reached Bozeman as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. The small frontier town spread out along a dusty main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a general store, a saloon, a livery stable, and a modest hotel that Daniel led her toward without hesitation. "Mrs. Pemberton runs a respectable establishment here," he said. "She will see you settled comfortably, and I can inquire about arranging proper transport onward, wherever you mean to go next." Eva realized, with a small pang she had not expected, that this meant their journey together was ending. Tomorrow, or perhaps the day after, she would continue on toward San Francisco, and Daniel Garrison would return to his cabin in the mountains, and their paths, so briefly and strangely intertwined, would likely never cross again. "Daniel," she said as he helped her down from the horse outside the hotel, "I do not know how to properly thank you. You saved my life yesterday and asked for nothing in return." "You do not owe me thanks, Miss Shelton," Daniel said, though something in his gray eyes suggested her words had affected him more than he let on. "Any decent man would have done the same." "Perhaps," Eva said, "but not every man could have done it with such kindness." "I will not forget it." Daniel held her gaze a moment longer than was strictly proper, and Eva felt something pass between them, unspoken and uncertain but undeniably present. Then he stepped back, tipping his hat. "I will check on you in the morning," he said. "Make sure you are settled before I head back up the mountain." Eva watched him lead his horse toward the livery stable and found herself, against every ounce of good sense she possessed, hoping that morning would not come too quickly. Mrs. Pemberton, a stout woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, welcomed Eva into the hotel with the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen every manner of traveler pass through her doors. She drew a hot bath, provided a clean dress from her own modest collection to replace Eva's torn traveling clothes, and settled her into a small but comfortable room overlooking the main street. "You are fortunate Daniel Garrison found you," Mrs. Pemberton said as she helped Eva with the buttons of the borrowed dress. "That man does not come to town often, keeps mostly to himself up in those mountains, but he has a good heart underneath all that quiet. Saved my own nephew from a bear trap gone wrong 2 winters back, carried him 15 miles on his own back to get him proper doctoring. He seems a remarkable man," Eva said, and heard the warmth in her own voice before she could temper it. Mrs. Pemberton's eyes sharpened with sudden interest. "Does he now?" she said, a knowing note entering her voice that made Eva's cheeks flush. "I only meant that he was very kind to me," Eva said quickly. "Of course, dear," Mrs. Pemberton said, though her expression suggested she was not entirely convinced. "Kind is one word for it, I suppose." That evening, Eva took her supper in the hotel's small dining room and found herself, despite her exhaustion, unable to stop thinking of Daniel Garrison. She thought of the gentle way he had lifted her onto his horse, the careful attention he had paid to her comfort throughout their journey, the surprising depth of his knowledge, and the quiet sorrow that seemed to linger beneath his composed exterior when he spoke of the war and the life he had left behind in Ohio. She told herself it was foolish to dwell on a man she had known barely a day, a man whose life was so entirely different from her own that any connection between them could only be temporary, born of circumstance rather than any true compatibility. She was a perfumer bound for San Francisco, a woman with ambitions that had nothing to do with mountain cabins and solitary living. Daniel Garrison was a mountain man who had chosen isolation over the comforts of society, who had made his peace with a quiet life far from the concerns that drove Eva forward. And yet, as she lay in the unfamiliar hotel bed that night, she found her thoughts returning again and again to the warmth of his arm around her as they rode, to the low rumble of his voice as he named wildflowers for her, to the gentleness in eyes that had seen more horror than she could imagine. She did not know what to make of these feelings, only that they frightened her with their intensity, given how briefly she had known him. Daniel Garrison did not sleep well that night either, though he would not have admitted it to anyone. He sat outside the small room he had taken above the livery stable, smoking a pipe he rarely bothered with anymore, and found his thoughts circling back again and again to Eva Shelton's face as she had described the flowers of the Wildflower meadow, the genuine wonder in her voice despite her exhaustion and fear. He had lived alone in these mountains for 9 years, had convinced himself he had made peace with solitude, that the quiet life he had built for himself was enough. But something about the woman he had found lost among the wildflowers had unsettled that careful peace, had reminded him of things he had told himself he no longer wanted, a companion to share his evenings with, someone to talk to besides the horse and the mountains themselves. He told himself it was foolish to entertain such thoughts about a woman he had known for barely a day, a woman whose life was bound for cities and society, for a career that would take her far from the isolated mountains he called home. She would continue on to San Francisco, or wherever her ambitions led her, and he would return to his cabin, and this strange, sudden connection between them would fade into memory soon enough. But even as he told himself this, he found he did not entirely believe it. Morning came, and Daniel presented himself at the hotel as promised, finding Eva already awake and dressed, sitting with Mrs. Pemberton in the small parlor discussing arrangements for onward travel. She looked up as he entered, and something in her expression, a brightness that had not been there the day before despite her evident exhaustion, made his chest tighten in a way he was not entirely prepared for. "Daniel," she said, rising to greet him, "I was just discussing with Mrs. Pemberton about transport to the railhead. She says there is a stagecoach that runs through twice a week, bound eventually for the rail line east of here." "When does the next one leave?" Daniel asked, and found himself hoping, against his better judgment, that the answer would not be too soon. 3 days, Mrs. Pemberton supplied. "Gives Miss Shelton time to recover properly from her ordeal, and time enough to send word ahead about her lost supplies and horse, in case that guide of hers thinks to sell them off before word reaches the authorities." "I had not thought of that," Eva said, frowning. "Holly's took nearly everything I own besides my perfume case. If there is any chance of recovering it, I can make some inquiries," Daniel offered. "I know most everyone who passes through this territory, and a man selling off goods that are not his tends to draw notice sooner or later." "I would be grateful," Eva said, "though I do not wish to impose further on your kindness. You have already done more than I could have asked." "It is no imposition," Daniel said, and meant it more than he probably should have. "I do not have anywhere pressing to be." Over the following 3 days, Daniel found reasons to remain in Bozeman rather than returning immediately to his mountain cabin, telling himself and anyone who asked that he was simply seeing to the matter of Eva's stolen supplies, making inquiries at the general store and the saloon about a man matching Holly's description. In truth, he found himself drawn back to the hotel each evening, sharing supper with Eva in the small dining room, their conversations stretching longer each night as they discovered, piece by piece, how much they had in common despite their vastly different lives. Eva, for her part, found herself in no hurry to see the stagecoach depart. She told herself this was merely practical, that she needed the time to recover from her ordeal, to replace what supplies she could before continuing her journey. But she knew, in the quiet honesty of her own heart, that the true reason she welcomed the delay was the prospect of spending more time in Daniel Garrison's company. On the second evening, Daniel arrived at the hotel with news that made Eva's heart leap with unexpected hope. "I found him," he said, settling into the chair across from her at the dinner table, his expression carefully neutral though something like satisfaction lingered beneath it. "Holly's. He was trying to sell your horse to a rancher 2 miles outside town, along with some of your supplies. I convinced him it would be in his best interest to return everything he had not already sold, and to do so without argument." "How did you convince him?" Eva asked, though something in Daniel's expression suggested she might not entirely want to know the answer. "I can be persuasive when the occasion calls for it," Daniel said, a faint smile touching his mouth. "He will not be troubling you further, and your horse and most of your supplies are being held at the livery stable. A few items were already sold, I'm afraid, but I recovered what money he had gotten for them, which should cover replacing what is lost." Eva stared at him, overwhelmed. "Daniel, I do not know what to say. You have done so much for me, a stranger you owed nothing to." "You are not a stranger anymore, Eva," Daniel said quietly, and the use of her given name, spoken with such gentleness, sent a warmth through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire crackling nearby. "No," she agreed softly, "I suppose I am not." They sat in comfortable silence for a long moment, the weight of unspoken feelings hanging between them, before Eva found the courage to voice something that had been troubling her since their conversation days before. "Daniel, may I ask you something personal?" "You can ask," Daniel said. "Cannot promise I will answer easy, but you can ask. The girl you mentioned back in Ohio, the one you had promised yourself to before the war, what became of her?" Daniel's expression grew distant, and for a long moment Eva feared she had overstepped, had asked something too painful for him to share. But then he sighed, and answered with the same quiet honesty he had shown throughout their acquaintance. "Her name was Sarah," he said. "We grew up together, our family's farms shared a fence line. I asked her to marry me before I left for the war, and she said yes, promised to wait for me. When I came home, 4 years later, I learned she had married another man 2 years into my absence. Cannot say I blame her for it. 4 years is a long time to wait on a man who might never come home at all, and the letters I managed to send grew fewer and further between as the war dragged on, and I grew more and more changed by what I was seeing. I am sorry, Eva said softly. That must have hurt terribly coming home to that. It did at the time, Daniel admitted. Though looking back now, I think perhaps it was a mercy, in its own strange way. The man who came home from that war was not the same man who had asked her to marry him. I do not know that we would have made each other happy, not with the things I carried back with me. Better she found happiness with someone whole, someone who could give her the life she deserved without the shadows I brought home. You do not give yourself enough credit, Eva said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. A man who carries shadows can still offer someone a good life, Daniel. Sometimes those shadows make a person more capable of kindness, not less, because they understand suffering in a way others cannot. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his gray eyes, and Eva wondered if she had spoken too boldly, revealed too much of what she was beginning to feel toward him. "You are a remarkable woman, Eva Shelton," he said finally, his voice rough with an emotion he seemed to be working hard to contain. "I do not think I have met anyone quite like you before." "Nor I anyone quite like you, Daniel Garrison," Eva replied, and the air between them seemed to still, charged with something neither of them was yet ready to name aloud. The stagecoach was scheduled to depart the following morning, and Eva spent that final evening in a state of quiet turmoil, uncertain how to reconcile the ambitions that had brought her west with the unexpected feelings that had taken root in her heart over these few brief days with Daniel Garrison. She found him waiting for her outside the hotel after supper, standing beneath the wooden awning with his hat in his hands, an uncharacteristic nervousness in his posture that she had not seen from him before. "Eva," he said, "I wanted to speak with you before you leave tomorrow. There is something I need to say, and I am not certain I will find the courage to say it if I wait any longer." Eva's heart quickened. "What is it, Daniel?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond her, out toward the darkening mountains that had been his home for 9 solitary years. "I know we have known each other only a few days," he began. "I know your life is bound for San Francisco, for the perfumery you mean to build there, and I know a mountain man with a cabin and a trap line has no business asking a woman like you to consider anything different. But these past few days, Eva, I have felt something I had convinced myself I would never feel again. Something I thought that mountain and that solitude had cured me of needing." Daniel Eva started, but he pressed on, as though needing to finish before his courage failed him entirely. "I am not a man of many words, and I know this is not proper, asking you this after knowing you such a short time. But I cannot let you get on that stagecoach tomorrow without telling you that I have come to care for you, more deeply than I know how to explain. And I would ask if you would consider it, staying a while longer, giving whatever this is between us a chance to grow into something more." Eva felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. "Daniel, I have felt it too. From nearly the first moment you found me in that meadow, I have felt something I do not entirely understand, something that frightens me with how quickly it has grown. But my perfumery, my ambitions, I would not ask you to give those up," Daniel said quickly. "I would never ask a woman to abandon her dreams for mine. I only ask that you consider whether there might be room for both, whether a life here with me might hold space for the perfumer you mean to become." "How could that even be possible?" Eva asked, though there was no rejection in her question, only genuine curiosity. "Your life is in these mountains, Daniel. Mine was meant to be in a city, with a shop, with customers and commerce." "Bozeman is growing," Daniel said. "More folks arrive every season. A shop here would serve a smaller market than San Francisco, true, but there is opportunity in being the first, in establishing something before the crowds arrive. And these mountains, Eva, they are full of flowers you have never encountered before, full of scents no other perfumer in this country possesses. You said so yourself in that meadow before you even knew my name." Eva stared at him, the pieces of a future she had not dared imagine suddenly taking shape before her, and found her heart aching with the possibility of it. "You would want me to stay," she said softly, "truly stay and build something here." "I would want that more than anything I have wanted in 9 years," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I would not ask you to decide something so significant after only a few days' acquaintance. Take the time you need. Go to San Francisco if that is where your heart still leads you. But know that whatever you decide, I will not forget these days we have shared, and I will not forget you, Eva Shelton." Eva reached up, her hand trembling slightly, and touched Daniel's rough cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her palm. "I do not need San Francisco to decide," she said. "I need only a little more time here in Bozeman to see if what I am feeling is as real as it seems. Would you allow me that, Daniel? A few weeks, perhaps, before I make any decision about where my future truly lies." Daniel's face broke into a smile, the first truly unguarded smile Eva had seen from him, and it transformed his rugged features into something almost boyish despite the weathering of 9 hard years in the wilderness. "I would allow you a lifetime, if that is what you needed," he said. "But I will settle gladly for a few weeks, if it means the chance of more." That night, Eva sent word ahead that she would not be taking the stagecoach after all, and arranged instead to extend her stay at Mrs. Pemberton's hotel while she considered her future. Mrs. Pemberton, when informed of the change in plans, did little to hide her satisfaction, offering Eva a knowing smile that suggested she had suspected this outcome from the very first evening Eva had mentioned Daniel Garrison's kindness. Over the following weeks, Eva and Daniel's courtship unfolded with the steady, deliberate pace of two people determined to build something lasting rather than rushing toward a conclusion neither fully understood. Daniel divided his time between his mountain cabin and Bozeman, riding down every few days to see Eva, to walk with her through the wildflower meadows that had first brought them together, gathering samples for the perfume she had begun experimenting with using a small workspace. Mrs. Pemberton allowed her to set up in an unused storage room behind the hotel. Eva learned to identify dozens of new flowers under Daniel's patient instruction, each excursion into the mountains yielding new discoveries that fueled her growing excitement about the perfumery she now dared imagine building in this frontier town, rather than the distant city she had originally intended. Daniel, in turn, found himself opening up more with each passing week, sharing memories of the war he had long kept locked away, finding in Eva's compassionate listening a healing he had not realized he still needed after all these years. One afternoon in late August, as they walked together through a meadow not far from where they had first met, Daniel stopped suddenly and knelt beside a cluster of small white flowers that Eva had never seen before, their petals delicate and star-shaped, releasing a scent when disturbed that was unlike anything in her collection, something cool and green with an undertone of honey. "What is this one?" she asked, kneeling beside him to examine the blooms more closely. "Never seen it myself," Daniel admitted. "Might be something rare, growing only in this particular spot. Mountain conditions can create flowers that exist nowhere else in the world, isolated pockets where the soil and elevation combine just right." Eva carefully gathered several samples, her heart racing with the possibility of what this discovery might mean. "If this scent is truly unique to this meadow, Daniel, it could become the signature of everything I create here. A perfume that exists nowhere else in the world, because the flower itself exists nowhere else." "Then I suppose we ought to name it," Daniel said, watching her with warm affection as she worked. "Seems only right, given that it seems to have chosen this particular moment to reveal itself to us." "What would you name it?" Eva asked. Daniel considered for a long moment, his gray eyes moving from the flower to Eva's face and back again. "Shelton's Grace," he said finally. "Seeing as you are the one who found it, and grace seems the only fitting word for something so delicate and unexpected." Eva felt her throat tighten with emotion at the simple gift of his words. "Shelton's Grace," she repeated softly. "I think that is perfect, Daniel." It was in that meadow, surrounded by the very flowers that had first brought them together, that Daniel finally worked up the courage to kiss her. his large hands cupping her face with a tenderness that belied his considerable strength, his lips meeting hers with a gentleness that spoke of months of restrained longing finally given permission to express itself. Eva melted into the kiss, her hands finding purchase in the fabric of his shirt, and when they finally parted, both slightly breathless, she found tears of happiness gathering in her eyes. "I have wanted to do that since the very first day I found you in this meadow," Daniel admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Though I would never have acted on it then, with you so frightened and vulnerable." "I am glad you waited," Eva said, smiling up at him. "Though I confess I have wanted the same thing for longer than I have been willing to admit, even to myself." They walked back to town that evening hand in hand, the wildflowers swaying golden in the light of the setting sun. And Eva knew, with a certainty that surprised her with its completeness, that whatever uncertainty had brought her west, whatever fear had gripped her when Hollies abandoned her in that same meadow weeks before, had led her exactly where she was meant to be. The weeks that followed brought new developments that solidified Eva's growing certainty about her future in Bozeman. She used the money recovered from Hollies, along with savings she had carried west, to secure a small storefront on the town's main street, converting it gradually into both a shop and a workspace where she could distill and blend the perfumes she created from the wildflowers Daniel helped her gather. Word spread quickly through the small frontier community about the perfumer who had arrived under such dramatic circumstances, and curious townsfolk began stopping by to sample her creations, many leaving as customers, charmed by scents unlike anything available from the catalogs that occasionally made their way west from eastern cities. Daniel, for his part, began spending more time in town than he had in years, though he never fully gave up his cabin in the mountains, explaining to Eva that the solitude and connection to the wilderness remained important to him, even as his heart opened to the possibility of a shared life. He took on work at the livery stable during his visits to town, using skills honed over 9 years of self-sufficient living to help with everything from shoeing horses to repairing wagons, earning a small but steady income that supplemented what he continued to make from trapping and trading furs during the winter months. It was during one such evening, as autumn began to paint the mountains with gold and crimson, that Daniel took Eva walking along the creek that ran behind the town, the same creek that flowed eventually past his mountain cabin, and asked her the question that had been building in his heart for weeks. "Eva," he said, stopping beside a fallen log much like the one where he had first found her weeping in the wildflower meadow, "I have thought long and hard about how to say this properly, and I do not think there is any way to make it sound as grand as you deserve. But I love you, more completely than I ever thought myself capable of loving anyone again after the war took so much from me, and I would be the happiest man in this territory if you would agree to be my wife." Eva felt her heart swell with a joy so complete it nearly stole her breath entirely. "Daniel Garrison," she said, tears already streaming down her cheeks, "I love you too, more than I can properly express. Yes. Yes, I will marry you." Daniel let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob of relief, and swept Eva into his arms, lifting her clear off the ground in his enthusiasm before setting her gently back down and kissing her with all the passion he had been carefully restraining throughout their courtship. When they finally parted, both breathless and laughing, Daniel reached into his coat pocket and produced a small ring, simply crafted from silver but clearly made with care. "I had this made by a silversmith who passes through Bozeman on occasion," he explained, slightly self-conscious as he slipped it onto her finger. "It is not much, not the kind of jewelry a fine lady from New Orleans might be accustomed to, but it is perfect," Eva interrupted, examining the ring through her tears. "It is exactly perfect, Daniel, because it comes from you." They were married 3 weeks later, in a small ceremony held in the meadow where they had first met, the very same wildflowers that had witnessed Eva's desperate tears now serving as witnesses to her joy. Mrs. Pemberton had insisted on helping arrange the celebration, recruiting half the town to contribute food and decorations, and even Hollies, in a strange twist of conscience, had sent word of apology, along with a small sum of money he claimed to owe Eva from his earlier theft, though neither Eva nor Daniel had expected to hear from him again. The town's minister, a circuit-riding preacher who happened to be passing through Bozeman that particular week, agreed to perform the ceremony, and Eva wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Pemberton had helped her sew, decorated with small sprigs of the very wildflowers that had brought her and Daniel together. Daniel, uncomfortable in a suit borrowed for the occasion but radiant with happiness nonetheless, stood waiting for her at the edge of the meadow, and when Eva walked toward him through the flowers, her father's memory in her heart though he could not be there to witness this day, she felt certain that even he would have approved of the man she had chosen. "Do you, Daniel Garrison, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the minister asked. "I do," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion, his gray eyes never leaving Eva's face. "And do you, Eva Shelton, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Eva said, and felt the words settle into her heart with a rightness that erased every doubt she had ever carried about her path west. They kissed as husband and wife for the first time to the cheers of the assembled townsfolk, and as the celebration continued into the evening with music and dancing and more food than Eva had seen since leaving New Orleans, she found herself marveling at how completely her life had transformed since that terrifying morning when she had woken alone in an unfamiliar wilderness, certain her journey had ended in disaster rather than the beginning of everything she had never known she wanted. The years that followed brought their own challenges, as any life built in the demanding territory of frontier Montana inevitably would, but Eva and Daniel faced each one together with a partnership that only deepened their love. Eva's perfumery grew steadily, her reputation spreading beyond Bozeman as travelers carried word of her unique creations to other frontier towns, and eventually even to cities further east, where wealthy women began specifically requesting the wildflower scents that could be found nowhere else in the country. She hired a young woman from a nearby ranch to help with the growing business, teaching her the careful art of distillation and blending that her own father had once taught her. Daniel continued to divide his time between the mountain cabin, which they maintained as a retreat from the growing bustle of Bozeman, and the small house they built together on the edge of town, close enough to Eva's shop that she could walk there each morning, but far enough to maintain some of the peaceful solitude Daniel still cherished. He took on more work training horses as the town grew, his gentle strength and patient manner making him particularly skilled with animals that other handlers found too wild or too frightened to work with safely. 2 years into their marriage, Eva gave birth to their first child, a son they named Thomas after Daniel's father, who had passed years before Daniel ever left for the war. The boy grew quickly into a sturdy, curious child, who seemed to have inherited his father's easy strength and his mother's keen sense of observation, often found trailing after Daniel on excursions into the mountains, already learning to identify the flowers and plants that had first brought his parents together. 2 years after Thomas's birth, Eva gave birth to a daughter, whom they named Grace, in honor of the flower that had bloomed so unexpectedly in the meadow of their courtship, the very scent that had become the signature fragrance of Eva's growing perfumery business, Shelton's Grace, now recognized as far away as Denver, and even, on occasion, in shops back in the eastern cities Eva had once thought would be the only place to build her legacy. By the time Grace had grown old enough to toddle alongside her older brother through the wildflower meadows their parents so loved, Bozeman itself had grown considerably, no longer the small frontier outpost it had been when Eva first arrived, but a proper town with its own newspaper, several churches, and a school where both Thomas and Grace would eventually learn their letters alongside the children of other families who had similarly chosen to build their lives in this corner of the Montana Territory. Daniel never fully abandoned his mountain cabin, and on quiet weekends throughout the year, the family would make the journey up to spend a few days in the peaceful solitude that had once been Daniel's entire world, teaching their children to fish in the creek that ran past the cabin, to identify the calls of different birds, to understand and respect the wilderness that had shaped their father into the man he had become. It was during one such visit, when Thomas was 7 and Grace was 5, that Eva found herself standing once again in the very meadow where Daniel had first found her lost and weeping so many years before. The wildflowers still bloomed there each summer, as reliable as the mountains themselves, and Eva often thought of that terrifying morning with a strange kind of gratitude, understanding now that without Holly's betrayal, without the fear and desperation that had driven her to that fallen log where she had finally allowed herself to cry, she might never have found the life that had become so much richer and more fulfilling than anything she had originally imagined for herself. "You are thinking about that day again," Daniel said, coming up beside her as their children chased butterflies further out in the meadow, his voice warm with the particular affection that had only grown deeper over the years of their marriage. "I always do when we come back to this spot," Eva admitted, leaning into the solid warmth of him as his arm came around her shoulders. "I think about how frightened I was, how certain I was that I had made some terrible mistake coming west at all. And now?" Daniel asked, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. "Now I think it was the best mistake I ever made," Eva said, smiling up at him. "If Holly's had not abandoned me, if I had made it safely to Bozeman without incident, I would never have found you, Daniel. I would have built my perfumery somewhere else, lived some other life entirely, and I would never have known what I was missing." Daniel leaned down and kissed her softly, the same gentle tenderness he had shown from their very first meeting still present after all these years together. "I thank God every day for that coward Holly's," he said, "though I do not imagine he thinks of that day with any particular fondness himself." Eva laughed, watching their children continue their pursuit of butterflies through the flowers that had witnessed the beginning of everything meaningful in her life. "Whatever became of him, do you suppose? Word reached me a few years back that he took up honest work on a ranch further south," Daniel said. "Seems the shame of what he did to you finally caught up with his conscience. Cannot say I forgive him easily, given what he put you through, but I suppose even a coward can find his way to better choices eventually." "Perhaps that is the lesson in all of it," Eva mused. "That even the worst circumstances can lead somewhere unexpected and good if we are willing to keep moving forward instead of giving up entirely. That, and perhaps a lesson about paying attention to wildflower meadows," Daniel added with a teasing smile. "Never know what treasures might be waiting there, lost and needing to be found." Eva swatted his arm playfully, though her heart swelled with the same overwhelming love that had grown steadily since that very first day. "Is that what I was? A treasure to be found?" "The finest treasure I have ever known," Daniel said, his teasing tone giving way to genuine, unguarded sincerity that still had the power to make Eva's breath catch even after years of marriage. "I thought when I came back from that war that I had lost the capacity to love anyone the way I once thought I loved Sarah. I convinced myself that solitude was enough, that the mountains and my own quiet company were all I needed or deserved. And then I found you, lost among these very flowers, and everything I thought I knew about my own heart changed entirely." "You changed my life too, Daniel," Eva said softly, reaching up to touch his weathered face, still handsome despite the additional lines that years and fatherhood had added around his gray eyes. "I came west looking for new scents, new flowers to build a business around. I never imagined I would find a husband, a family, a whole life I never knew I wanted until I had it." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching their children play in the golden afternoon light, the mountains rising majestic and eternal around them, the same mountains that had once represented terrifying isolation to a frightened, lost woman, but now represented only home. Only the deep and abiding peace of a life built on love and mutual respect, and the willingness of two people from vastly different worlds to find common ground in the wilderness that had brought them together. That evening, back at the cabin as the children slept soundly after their day of adventure in the meadow, Daniel and Eva sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast Montana sky. A bottle of Eva's latest creation, a blend using the same wild geranium Daniel had first identified for her years before, sitting between them as evidence of how far both their lives had traveled since that fateful summer. "Do you ever regret it?" Daniel asked quietly, breaking the peaceful silence between them. "Staying here, building your business in Bozeman instead of San Francisco. I know you had grander ambitions once, before I asked you to consider a different path." Eva considered the question seriously, understanding that Daniel truly wanted to know, that his own happiness remained tied to her fulfillment as much as to his own. "I think about San Francisco sometimes," she admitted honestly. "I wonder what my business might have become there, in a larger city with wealthier clients and grander opportunities. But then I think about what I would have missed, Daniel. Thomas and Grace would not exist in that other life. I would not know the particular joy of watching my children grow up surrounded by mountains and wildflowers instead of city streets. I would not have you and everything you have taught me about patience and gentleness and the kind of strength that does not need to announce itself loudly to be real." "That is a generous way to think about the sacrifices you made," Daniel said. "They do not feel like sacrifices anymore," Eva said firmly. "They feel like choices I would make again every single time, given the chance to choose differently. My business here may be smaller than what I might have built in San Francisco, but it is mine entirely, built on scents that exist nowhere else in this world, married to a life I never could have imagined for myself before that morning you found me in the meadow." Daniel reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers with hers in the darkness, and Eva felt again that same sense of rightness, of having found exactly where she belonged despite the winding, frightening path that had led her there. "I love you, Eva Shelton Garrison," he said, using her full married name with a reverence that still, after years together, could bring tears to her eyes. "I will love you until the day I die, and I thank whatever providence guided you to that meadow, guided me to find you there, for giving me a life I never thought I deserved after everything the war took from me." "I love you too, Daniel," Eva said, resting her head against his broad shoulder, feeling the steady strength of him beneath her, the same solid presence that had first offered her safety on that terrifying morning years before. "And I think, if I am honest, that meadow gave both of us exactly what we needed, even if neither of us could have known it at the time." They sat together long into the night, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead, two people from entirely different worlds who had found, against every reasonable expectation, a love that had grown only stronger and deeper with each passing year, rooted as surely in the wild Montana landscape as the flowers that had first brought them together. In the years that followed, Eva Shelton Garrison's Perfumery became known throughout the territory and beyond as a testament to what patience and genuine partnership could build, even in the most unlikely circumstances. Shelton's Grace, along with dozens of other unique scents developed from the wildflowers of the Montana mountains, brought a measure of prosperity to the family that neither Eva nor Daniel had anticipated when they first began their life together in that small frontier town. Thomas grew into a young man who inherited his father's love of the wilderness, alongside his mother's keen business sense, eventually taking over much of the harvesting and identification work that had once been solely Daniel's domain, while Grace developed her mother's talent for blending scents, showing an aptitude for the delicate work of perfumery from an early age that promised to carry the family business forward into another generation. Daniel never fully gave up his connection to the mountains that had shaped him, continuing to spend time in the cabin that had witnessed the beginning of his courtship with Eva. Though as the years passed, These retreats became more about sharing that beloved wilderness with his growing family than about the solitary escape they had once represented. He taught both his children, and later his grandchildren, to read the signs of the forest, to identify the flowers and plants that had first drawn their parents together, passing down not just practical knowledge, but a genuine reverence for the wild beauty that had given him back his capacity for love after the devastation of war had convinced him he had lost it forever. Eva, for her part, never forgot the terror of that morning when she had woken alone in the wilderness, abandoned and afraid, certain her journey west had ended in disaster. But she came to understand, with the wisdom that only years of happiness could provide, that sometimes the most frightening moments in life carry within them the seeds of the greatest joy, if only a person has the courage to keep moving forward, to trust in the kindness of strangers who might, against all expectation, become the truest loves of their lives. And so it was that on quiet summer evenings, when the wildflowers bloomed golden and violet and crimson across the meadows surrounding Bozeman, Daniel Garrison and Eva Shelton Garrison would often walk together to that same clearing where their story had begun, hand in hand, their children and eventually their grandchildren trailing behind them through the flowers. And they would remember, with hearts full of gratitude, the mountain man who had found a stranded perfumer lost among the wildflowers, and the love that had bloomed between them as surely and as beautifully as anything nature itself had ever created. Their story became something of a local legend in Bozeman over the years, told and retold by those who had witnessed its beginning, a reminder to anyone who heard it that the wild, untamed frontier held not only danger and hardship, but also the possibility of unexpected grace, of love found in the most unlikely of circumstances, between two people brave enough to trust in what they discovered growing between them. As resilient and enduring as the wildflowers that bloomed each summer across those same Montana meadows, generation after generation, exactly as they had on the day Daniel Garrison first found Eva Shelton, lost and afraid, and led her safely home.